Tonight in Democracy 20, the highest court in the land, restoring faith in the legal system.
The court system was very damaged when the Constitutional Court was created. So Constitutional Court really is a project to re-establish trust in the law.
How the Constitutional Court changes lives.
It attracted quite a lot of people because that was a landmark case. A woman fighting for her birthright in the democratic dispensation.
And looking back in history on this day, the launch of the 27 million self-help scheme on the 9th of April 1996. Well, good evening and welcome to this edition of Democracy 20. Our main theme for tonight is the Constitutional Court, which is, of course, the highest court of the land. Now, since its establishment in 1994, it has made very important judgments. 11 justices sit on the hallowed court benches, led by Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng.
In the wake of the first historic democratic election, the focus shifted to the judiciary. Overwhelmingly white and male, a credible and respected highest court was needed.
It has perhaps more legitimacy and more clout than any other court in South Africa, and it is relatively widely respected, in as much as we have to remember that we come from a history where the law was used to oppress people.
The Constitutional Court was established in 1994, formally opened by then-President Nelson Mandela in February the next year. Landmark judgments have been handed down in the last 2 decades. The death penalty was abolished. It didn't prove to be more effective in preventing murder. 5 years later, a ruling that the state had an obligation to provide decent housing for the poor.
One of the very first judgments, which created quite a stir at the time, was of course the Makwanyane judgments, in which the court declared the death penalty invalid. That was a huge thing, in which the Constitutional Court had to interpret the right of access to housing and said that all these social economic rights that you find in the Bill of Rights require the state to act reasonably at all times.
Another groundbreaking judgment, legally recognizing gay and lesbian unions. And in a victory for the Treatment Action Campaign, the Constitutional Court ordered government to make the antiretroviral drug nevirapine available in public hospitals and clinics to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And ruffling some feathers, the court ruled that legislation replacing the Scorpions crime-fighting unit with the Hawks was constitutionally invalid. The Constitutional Court is the final appellate court for matters involving interpretation of the Constitution. It's headed by the Chief Justice and his deputy. The 11 judges are appointed by the President from a list drawn up by the Judicial Services Commission. Judges serve for a term of 12 years. The issue of transformation remains unresolved.
There's really a big problem in that there are not enough women judges. There's also a question about a different type of transformation, and that is whether all the judges that are appointed, whether they are white or black, are actually really embodying and living the values of the Constitution.
Just how critical is the role of the Constitutional Court 20 years into democracy?
Democracy is not a thing that arrives. It's not a gift that is dropped on your doorstep on Christmas Day. It's a process that you've got to work on continually. The rule of law, human rights, democracy are all valuable norms and standards about which we've got to be alert and active at all times.
But many remain largely uninformed about the role of the Constitutional Court.
The importance of the Constitutional Court, I think, is to uphold our human rights.
The Constitution Hill is where the rights are implemented.
I don't know in terms of a lot of it. I'm not informed as much.
In an acclaimed building at Constitution Hill, 11 judges standing guard over the Constitution, protecting our human rights. Nozintombi Mia, SABC News.
Now, remember, you can please do take part in tonight's program. As we've been asking for you to do so, you can send us your emails this to elections@sabc.co.za. You can also send us SMSs to 33726. And remember to begin your SMS message with the word vote, and every SMS will cost you R150. For tweets, use the hashtag SABC Elections, and you can also find us on our Facebook page, SABC News Online. Send us your comments, send us what you'd like to see, what you'd like to hear. Maybe we can even have a conversation or with one of our guests. Speaking of which, joining me now is former Justice of the Constitutional Court, Judge Zak Yacoob, and he's in our studios in Durban. Good evening, Judge Yacoob, and welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us and taking part in tonight's program.
Good evening to everybody in South Africa and to you. It is wonderful to be part of this program, and more importantly, good to be here because I'm retired.
Well, Judge, just for this one, Democracy20, we celebrated. You were appointed to the bench in 1998 by former President Nelson Mandela, and you briefly served as acting Deputy Chief Justice during the long-term leave of Judge Dikgang Moseneke. Tell us about those early days of our Constitution, basically.
I got into the Constitutional Court 4 years after we got into our democracy, and the Constitutional Court had to perform a very important new role. Normally what courts do is that they decide on disputes between people. But once we had a constitution, government had to comply with the constitution, and it was necessary for a body to determine whether the government has complied with the constitution or not, whether the government has fulfilled the rights that people have in terms of the constitution or not. And it is for this reason then that there was a court of 11 people, appointed ultimately by the President on the recommendation of the Judicial Services Commission. And all 11 of us came from different parts of South Africa, from different spheres of life. Some of us came from townships, others of us came from different echelons of life. And our duty was to consult with each other so that we had a wide variety of views in determining the question as to whether the Parliament or the government or anyone else for that matter had complied with the Constitution. There were wonderful days where it was a different way of judging. It was judging where we understood that the truth, if it exists at all, is the truth reflected by the views of a large variety of people, so that we as 11 judges consulted with each other, talked to each other carefully, listened to each other, and came to conclusions as far as is possible unanimously. And our job was to maintain a balance, to stand between the government and Parliament on the one hand and the people on the other, to ensure that the people's rights were not trodden upon. It was a difficult job, it was an exciting job, but something which we did with considerable zeal and eagerness.
Indeed. Now, Judge Yacoob, what in your opinion have been the milestone judgments in as far as our Constitutional Court is concerned?
The effect of the judgments of the Constitutional Court have largely been to ensure, as I said, the balance between the government and the people. The difficulty, of course, is that there are separation of powers questions, so that quite often government is unhappy with the decisions of the court, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But the way in which government should react to our judgments was indicated by Nelson Mandela himself, I must say, at a time when I was not a member of the court, when the court gave a judgment against the president, and the president came on TV to say that the Constitutional Court must be obeyed. They are right, and it is fine that they have made a judgment against us. And the problem is that in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been, understandably, some hesitation on the part of government approving of our judgments wholeheartedly. But I hope that that will change, and there will be a realization that the executive, the legislature, and parliament, and the courts do different work, and we must have complete respect for each other.
Now, it's also said that you were the judge who brought much-needed lighter moments to the Constitutional Court while work was done on serious landmark judgments. For example, you objected to the use of the word "such" in judgments. What was that all about?
That's all about a bit of fetishness. I think that "such" is a lazy word. You use "such" when you don't know what words to use. So instead of "such," you can use words like if you want to use "like." But basically, it's just an effort to think carefully about what you want to say and say what you want to say instead of using the word "such" to duplicate things.
Now, is it true that you loved operatic renditions of Happy Birthday as well at lunchtimes? I mean, these stories seem to be coming. You were having so much fun at the Constitutional Court.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
I'm saying, is it true that you love the operatic renditions of Happy Birthday at lunchtimes, the days that the Concord judges were celebrating their birthdays?
Oh, no, we used to have very, very good lunches. No, we used to have very good lunches. The important thing about those lunches is that we were colleagues. We regarded ourselves as having a good collegial relationship, and having wonderful personal relationships was part of the idea of having a good court who talk to each other. And I suppose singing Happy Birthday to my colleagues was one way in which one develops a good relationship with each other, so that when you have to talk about hard things to people, they remember that you did sing Happy Birthday to them one day.
Now, finally, Judge, before we let you go, when you retired in November 2012, Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng described you as one of South Africa's treasured blessings, as you defied all odds, stereotypes and prejudices to develop yourself as one of the world's finest legal brains. Do you have a message for any South African child living in abject poverty or those with physical challenges?
Well, I'm humbled by what was said about me, but as far as I'm concerned, I am an ordinary human being who did my very best to achieve in the court what one could achieve.
Judge Yacoob, thank you very much for joining us and taking time, part of your intake time to join us rather in part of our program. That was Judge Zak Yacoob joining us from our Durban studios. He was, well, Justice of the Constitutional Court and was also taking part, as I said, right here on Democracy 20 from our Durban studios. We'll take a quick break. Don't go away. More for you right here on the show.
If you missed the Oscar Pistorius murder trial, watch the update and highlights as the case unfolds. Watch the witnesses' evidence led by Advocate Gerry Nel and the cross-examination by Advocate Barry Roo. All this on SABC News, your African news leader, at 9 to 9:30 p.m. from Monday to Friday.
Well, welcome back. You're still watching Democracy 20, and tonight we look at the achievements of the Constitutional Court, the highest court in the land. In Limpopo, a landmark Concord judgment 6 years ago changed the landscape of leadership for the Valoya community. In fact, Valoya community, I was right. This is outside Zanin. A female chief is now at the helm of the Nwa Mtiwa and surrounding areas and villages following a long battle for the chieftainship.
Tiniko Pilia Nwamitwa, the first female chief of the Batonga. She's the eldest daughter of Chief Bofoza Nwamitwa. When her father passed away, her uncle took over as caretaker chief because she had no brothers. In 1988, an agreement was reached that Philia will take over from her uncle when he passed on. But this didn't happen. Her uncle's son, Sidwell Nwamitwa, believed this would be in contradiction to the tribe's culture. The battle for leadership ensued, and the matter went to the High Court in Pretoria.
And the royal family, persisted that this problem had to be solved. Then we had to go to the High Court of South Africa. At the High Court of South Africa, we found an Afrikaner judge who said to us, well, the primogeniture rule still exists, that women cannot take over. If you take over, who will succeed you? But I said to him, I've got a birthright. He said, no, you can only take over if you act for somebody. I said, there is no one to act for. That is my birthright, although I'm a woman.
As a woman, Philia was prevented by law to exercise her birthright, but she was determined to challenge the law. After the Supreme Court of Appeal, the matter was referred to the highest court in the land.
They said it's the first time in this court that we have to postpone a case. The first time in this constitutional court that we have to interpret, because so many people went there from Nwamitwa and buses, the women, they said, no, want to hear what the judges are saying. And they said, no, the court is full. They said, no, we have to sit on the floor. So it attracted quite a lot of people because that was a landmark case. A woman fighting for her birthright in the democratic dispensation. So at the Constitutional Court, I was given my right, and in 2008, I was inaugurated.
The chief is now responsible for 11 villages and presides over 32 indunas, some of them women.
We are living in a democratic dispensation. We have female indunas, and our chief is also a woman. We are getting a lot of respect in this village, and there is development.
Chief Nwamitwa has been a member of parliament for several years now. When she's busy with parliamentary duties, a caretaker chief steps in to continue her work as chief.
When she is around, I get advices and the direction to take. I then instruct all the indunas on what is to be done.
Like many rural areas, Nwamitwa has a shortage of services. People still wash in the rivers. But the chief has brought hope to her land. She's facilitated the construction of a youth center with the aim of providing skills to young people.
Certainly a good story to tell about Chief Nwamitwa. Now, a number of foreign correspondents who were covering South Africa more than 20 years ago have felt compelled to return this year to witness Democracy20's year milestone. Now, our Washington correspondent Nina Maria Potts spoke to a couple of American reporters about the experiences of covering South Africa and their take on how much the country has changed.
For many foreign correspondents who covered South Africa in the 1980s, marking 20 years of democracy means a great deal. Steve Mufson covered apartheid South Africa for the Wall Street Journal from 1984 to 1986, including 2 states of emergency. And he wrote a book about the black uprisings of the 1980s. In May 1987, the government refused to renew his work permit, and he was expelled from the country. It took him 26 years to go back, and when he did, he found South Africa profoundly changed.
Being back. I mean, coming from the United States, we have a lot of hang-ups about race here, and in some ways I felt like, from an attitude point of view, South Africa had made more progress in 20 years that the United States made over a century or more.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, because people, I felt, were relaxed being around one another, eating in the same places. I mean, they weren't necessarily eating together at the same tables, but I just felt that there was a tension that had been in part of South African society that had really dissipated.
Despite being accused by the apartheid regime of depicting a negative image of South Africa to the outside world, Steve Mufson says he was always optimistic about the country's future.
The foundations for a new South Africa were all there in the 1980s. Independent press, a fairly independent judiciary, community organizations in which people came together, determined priorities, often negotiated with white authorities, learned to compromise. There were trade unions doing the same thing. A lot of what I wrote about were township-level negotiations on consumer boycotts and rent boycotts and things like that. So all the structures of a more democratic South Africa were there in the mid-'80s.
Not everyone was so certain that democracy would take hold. For Geraldine Eddings, an African-American reporter for the Baltimore Sun, said that in 1990 there were no guarantees of which way the country would go.
The South Africa that I covered as a journalist in 1990 we felt was constantly on the verge of cataclysm. You know, no one knew if there would be a huge bloody civil war. No one knew if the country would blow up. Businesses were pulling out, people were afraid, and there was violence that really everybody at the time figured might at any point escalate into something that the country couldn't turn back from. So the South Africa today has overcome that.
As a young black reporter, she experienced the brutal side of the apartheid regime firsthand until people realized she was an American.
My accent, it flipped a switch so that suddenly I was no longer a black person who was being greeted by perhaps white South Africans with attitudes about black people, but I was an American.
For many US correspondents covering South Africa's democratic transition, the chance to report the truth was a privilege they'll never forget.
You had the freedom to move around as a foreign correspondent that you did not have as a South African journalist.
That two-way process underpins the world's best international reporting, according to the Newseum, which from the heart of Washington serves to protect press freedoms around the world.
One of the things that I think foreign correspondents can do is bring that view both into the country of here's a different way to do it, or a different perspective, and then take back to their own countries the opportunity perhaps to observe and learn from newer and innovative societies.
South Africa's first democratic elections hold a special place in the minds of many Americans and foreign correspondents who were deployed to report on history in the making. And there's a real admiration here for how far South Africa has come and a desire to help protect basic press freedoms. Nina Maria-Potts, SABC News in Washington.
Democracy 20 continues after this short break. Stay tuned.
Zimbabwe faces its worst food shortage in 4 years. Tens of thousands have begun receiving food aid.
Finally, some help to stave off hunger for at least another month. Cattle ranching Rishavane is the worst affected.
Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies says he can confirm that South Africa remains open for business.
The bill will confirm that South Africa remains open to foreign investment.
Egerson is showing his hand in preparation of the Chan tournament in January.
Primetime News, daily at 6 p.m. on SABC News.
Right at the back of the Drakensberg Sun Hotel is the beautiful dam, where you can canoe and take a leisurely boat ride for your enjoyment.
The name of this dam is Black Nkwaku. It's about 15 meters deep.
That's Kaleidoscope, Sundays 5:30 p.m. on SABC News.
You're watching Democracy 20 now. Time now to look back at this day in history. Now, on the 9th of April 1996, the 27 million self-help scheme was launched in the Free State. The scheme, which was funded by the Department of Agriculture and Environmental Affairs, was devised to set up entrepreneurs in the province. This is how SABC News reported on the matter 18 years ago.
The Department of Agriculture and Environmental Affairs is being restructured. Some 500 employees face retrenchment in this streamlining process. But the department says it wants to contribute to the economy of the province, not to the unemployment rate. That's why they've launched the self-help project.
Now this person is here, he's involved, he's using his own money to buy maybe cows and or to plants. They're already employing people from outside who are working from them. So it's growing the economy. And what's very important is the contribution towards research, is that the researchers now are sitting here and they're researching an actual case of how to establish an entrepreneur.
The scheme consists of a variety of projects aimed at turning the jobless into their own bosses. Those to be retrenched will get salaries until the end of the year. And training at the Glen Agricultural College, they hope to establish entrepreneurs in the private sector. The training will include more than just the basics of farming.
Now the most important thing is how to keep money, how to do the budget, and how to plan to take that particular crops from point A to point B for marketing in order to generate income.
The projects are not only agricultural. A camping and fishing area has been set aside to teach the basics of tourism. Once the entrepreneurs are established, they will rent the state-owned land. There is also a Sangoma who is growing herbs and plants used in traditional medicine. Once the scheme gets off the ground, the department plans to involve communities throughout the province and hopes to help 10,000 new entrepreneurs a year. Richard Newton at Glen for Television News.
Muti project, that one got my interest right there. Anyway, that's where we have to leave the show for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us right here on Democracy 20. See you again tomorrow evening, 6:30 on SABC 3, as well as SABC News Channel 404. Goodbye.